A leading polling research company says the U.S. election remains in the balance because the swing states that determine the election outcome are still too close to call. Campaigns will crisscross those battlegrounds in the 4 days left until Election Day, with incumbent Republican President Donald Trump and Democratic rival Joe Biden focus entirely on those regions that in these late stages of the race hold sway in determining which nominee captures the White House. Correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease talked to the Public Affairs Director of polling company IPSOS for further insight.
Mallory Newall, thank you so much for speaking to us and welcome to SABC News.
Thanks for having me.
So there's much we could talk about as it relates to polling in the US election, but perhaps let's begin with the broad strokes, right? What do the numbers tell us from a national perspective in this presidential race? And what are the key takeaways so close to Election Day?
That's a great question, Sherwin. I think the biggest takeaway at the national level is that the numbers and the horse race have been remarkably steady thus far in this election cycle. We continue to see former Vice President Joe Biden having roughly a 10 percentage point lead over President Donald Trump. And there haven't really been any deviations from what we've been seeing so far.
So what are the key demographic shifts that are driving the numbers we are seeing? And perhaps if you could do a comparison to what we saw in 2016 and what's really driving Joe Biden's ascendancy in this race?
That's a great question. I think there are multiple factors at play here. The first is a key group that the media and pollsters alike have been talking a lot about, and that is white suburban women. In 2016, President Trump won a majority of all white women. But then in 2018, in the midterm elections, we saw white suburban women in particular shifting toward Democratic congressional candidates, and that's how Democrats were able to flip the House. And this time around in this presidential cycle, we're seeing President Trump really struggle to win back those white suburban women. So that's the first thing. The second thing that we're seeing here is that there is a high volume of enthusiasm and intent to vote on both sides. And frankly, right now, there are just fewer undecideds than there were 4 years ago. We're seeing about less than 5%, or right around 5%, are still having to make up their mind in this election compared to like 15% in 2016. So folks are really entrenched on both sides of the aisle. Most partisans have made up their mind, and there's fewer people up for grabs this time around.
What about that older 65 plus category, right? Especially when you look at a place like Florida that is so pivotal in any US presidential election. What are the trends you're seeing in that 65 and older category? Because they are essentially one of the largest demographics who turn out to vote in a US presidential election.
They certainly are. And the senior citizen bloc is a big grab for one candidate or the other. And we're seeing that President Trump isn't doing as well with voters 65 and over as he did in 2016. So that remains a question that I think we'll have to wait and see the answer to next week.
Let's talk a bit about some of the favorability numbers towards Donald Trump, right? Standing at currently 35% favorable, 57% unfavorable. Favorability towards Biden at 44%, unfavorable 43%. So, he's not much more popular in that sense than Donald Trump is, which is interesting. Currently, only 38% of Americans approve of the way Donald Trump is handling the coronavirus, which is up from apparently 35% in early October. To what extent is coronavirus shaping the outcome of this election?
Coronavirus is the main issue in this election. It is the biggest factor and frankly is really the dominant issue from how they feel about the president to how people intend to vote. It is influencing every aspect of this election. We know from our polling at Ipsos that President Trump's approval rating, both overall and when it comes to handling the coronavirus, has been really steady. So people know how they feel about the president, and generally they're really unable to separate how they feel about the job he's doing overall from how they feel about his handling of the pandemic.
Let's get into the weeds in some of the swing states because, as we explained to our viewers back home, it's not so much about the popular vote, but much more about the Electoral College in determining who wins the election. Fresh polling from Ipsos this week shows tight races in must-win Florida, particularly if you're Republican, and then Arizona, which has only voted for a Democratic nominee once since 1952. Talk about those two states and what they're telling us right now.
That's right. And I think your point about, this is not a national race. This is a race to be won in the states. That's exactly right. And that's important to remember. Now, in many of the battleground states that we're tracking in, we're seeing a very tight race in Arizona, as you mentioned, in Florida, and in North Carolina. Those are three states that are really too close to call right now. Arizona, one of the factors I think we're seeing at play here is really a demographic shift over time. Earlier this year, Pew Research Center released some research about the changing demographics in this country and how there are basically fewer white people making up an electorate and more people of color in places like Arizona. That's particularly the case. There are more Hispanic voters and less white voters. So we're seeing a demographic shift, which is also sort of coupled with a shift in partisan affiliation. And, those three Sunbelt states that I mentioned are, I think, really going to be key to who wins the White House next week.
A lot of focus also, Mallory, and you'll bear me out here, on Pennsylvania, right? They've been crisscrossing that swing state. Both candidates, the president will be back in Pennsylvania this weekend. What are you seeing in Pennsylvania? Democrats talk about this resurrecting the blue wall in the Midwest, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Michigan, Wisconsin looking better for Democrats, but Pennsylvania still in the mix.
Sure, that's right. And those are the other three states that we've been tracking weekly since September. And as you mentioned, Michigan and Wisconsin are a bit more favorable toward former Vice President Biden right now. According to our latest poll in Pennsylvania, Biden holds a very slight lead in Pennsylvania. And many people will remember that those are the three states that very narrowly handed Trump the victory in 2016. So they too will be key to watch next week, though things are looking a bit better for Biden in those three states, including in Pennsylvania, than they are in Arizona, North Carolina, and Florida.
As much as this is a focus on who wins the White House, the Senate is very much in play. What are your numbers showing us from a national perspective? Who do you, in terms of polling, deem will control the Senate next January?
That's a great question, Sherwin.
It's a tough one, I know.
It is, but for this, I'm going to rely on some of the forecasting results that we've seen, which, again, it's important to remember that polling and forecasting are slightly different tools, right? Our friends at the University of Virginia Center for Politics, their forecast right now has things looking like a toss-up for who's going to control the Senate, predicting, I think, 50 Democratic seats, 47 Republican, but there's still 3 up for grabs. So we could be looking at a very, very narrow majority. I think that's what we'll be seeing one way or the other. Whether Democrats or Republicans win, it will be by a very slim majority to take the Senate.
So we're seeing record turnout, right? Almost 80 million voters have cast their ballots. That's almost more than half of what we saw in 2016. And so much concern in the United States about barriers to voting, right? The obstacles that are presented to voters in this country. I know you've done some polling on that. What are the main takeaways from that polling?
All Americans are concerned about the integrity of our election. Now, concerns vary typically by partisan affiliation. So what I mean by that is more Democrats tend to be concerned about things like election interference or intimidation, voter suppression. And Republicans, on the other hand, tend to be more concerned about things like voter fraud, especially mail-in fraud, which is something that the president himself has talked about this cycle. And so consequently, you're actually seeing a difference in how people are stating that they plan to vote this cycle. According to our polling, more Democrats plan to vote early or vote by mail, whereas more Republicans tend to vote on election day. But you're exactly right when it comes to turnout, and I think it speaks to the high certainty and the high level of enthusiasm that we're seeing on both sides as to why nearly 80 million Americans have cast their ballot already. Forecasters are thinking, 65% turnout or higher, which would even eclipse the level that we saw in 2008 when Barack Obama was first elected president.
Yeah, they're saying it'll be the record. They're comparing it to, I think, 1908. So we're talking about a 112-year record that might be broken.
This is just the year for once in a lifetime or once in a century things. A global pandemic, voter turnout. Yeah.
Donald Trump. The pall of 2016, of course, hangs over this election like a dark cloud, particularly as it relates to people's perceptions of polling back in 2016. What the polls told us on election day and what the results were in the end? What are some of the lessons that 2016 teaches IPSOS, for example, in how they conduct and approach their polling in 2020?
Sure, and that's certainly the question of the hour. Couple of things. First, I think it's important to remember that it's a little bit of a misnomer to say that the polls were wrong in 2016. At the national level, actually, the final polls had an average of a 3 percentage point victory for Hillary Clinton, and she won the popular vote by about 2 percentage points. So within 1 point, pretty accurate. Now, at the state level, there was much more error, and I think this was also compounded by how people were reporting on the polls. As things tightened in the last week of the election, which we saw them doing, there was still this sense in reporting that, Donald Trump could never be elected and that Hillary Clinton had a lead, talking about a lead for her when in some cases races were within the margin of error and it should have been called a toss-up. Now, we still have used that as a learning experience, and we've done a lot of looking back at 2016 to ask how we can improve. One of the key things that we at IPSOS are doing and other pollsters are doing as well is looking at educational attainment in our polls. We know, for example, that Donald Trump handily won white non-college educated voters in 2016. And that showed us that educational attainment can be a really key indicator of your vote preference. So now we're weighting our polls by education to make sure that we don't have too many college educated voters and that our universe looks how it should from an education perspective, as well as, making sure that it's representative by gender, age, race, ethnicity.
Final question for you. Who's going to win?
That's a great question. I think...
Based on the polling. Based on polling,
sure. There are certain battleground states that are still too close to call right now, Sherwin, especially in the Sun Belt, Arizona, Florida, North Carolina. And I think at this point, we need to keep an eye on those states, remembering that this is a state-level election. Races will be won or lost in just a handful of states, not at the national level.
Is it fair, though, as journalists, we kind of look at the average of polling, and sometimes in our reporting we say it's favoring Biden at this point, right? Would it be fair to say sort of favoring Biden given the numbers we're seeing?
Certainly. At the national level, yes, it's fair to say that. As I mentioned, national polling has been remarkably steady. We're not really seeing a tightening that we did see in 2016. Biden continues to poll at maybe slightly above 50%. So it is fair to say that national polling, at least, does give Biden an advantage right now.
Mallory, good to see you, and thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me.
Mallory Newall is a U.S. Director of Public Affairs at IPSOS, the world's third largest marketing research company that continues to conduct a broad spectrum of polling as it pertains to this U.S. presidential election.